Hello, thank you for joining me in this Bible study as we go to the Old Testament book of Genesis. The Old Testament book of Genesis, I would encourage you to get your Bibles and go there. In one of our recent posts on our Facebook page, we asked the question as to who's your favorite Old Testament character? And of course, that's really hard to choose from. I know that there's many that we really love to study, and we also think about the applications that we get from their lives. But a couple of you had actually named Joseph as being your favorite, and I must say he is one of my favorites in my studies as well. And so I decided, as we've been talking about spiritual giants of the Bible on our Sunday evening study, I thought, well, let's spend some time and let's talk about Joseph. And there's just so many life lessons that we get from Joseph. And I want us to, again, in a series of lessons, look, because, again, Joseph covers a lot of territory in the book of Genesis. And so I want us to begin the series of lessons on this wonderful biblical character who really was a spiritual giant of his time. And again, as many times as I've studied this, it's such this individual, Joseph, is such an interesting and intriguing character that we find. And so the very account of Joseph's life, I mentioned, it takes up more space in the entire book of Genesis than any other single individual in that book. And we think about that. More space has been dedicated to Joseph than to Adam, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, or even his own father Jacob, for that matter. And so as we endeavor in this study together, I believe we shall see the significance of such a life as that of Joseph's. There are more than a dozen chapters that describes the life of Joseph. And as we endeavor in a study of those chapters in the book of Genesis, Joseph's life provides us with some very powerful lessons that we can still apply to our lives today. And truly, as the Apostle Paul would even say there in Romans 15 and verse 4, he says, "For whatever things were written before were written for our learning, that we, through the patience and comfort of the Scriptures, might have hope." What a truth that is. And as I read and have read this account many, many times in my life, I think about how the family of Joseph, they had some serious issues going on. And I looked up for how a dysfunctional family would be defined, and I found that a dysfunctional family is a family in which conflict, behavior, and often child neglect or abuse in a way that causes some members of the family to accommodate such inappropriate actions. And I thought, wow, what a definition, because as I look at that definition and I look at Joseph's family, I wasn't sure if dysfunctional really was the best descriptive terminology for his family, because the things that happen in that family were very alarming, and I would even say warped even. So very briefly, let me just mention a few things to bring us up to speed of some of Joseph's family history before we get into actually studying the life of Joseph. So this kind of takes us back just a little bit where it starts with Joseph's great-grandfather, Abraham. And we remember that Abraham and Sarah were not able to conceive, so Sarah gave Abraham permission to have a child with her servant, Hagar, which he did. And that, of course, was Ishmael in Genesis chapter 16. So Abraham and Sarah later went on to have, we remember, Isaac from Genesis chapter 21. And then Isaac then had two sons with his wife Rebekah, Genesis chapter 25, that being Jacob and Esau. And in that same chapter, we find issues in that family as Isaac loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob. You see that in chapter 25 and verse 28 of Genesis. But also in that same chapter, we find that Esau sold his birthright to Jacob for bread and stew of lentils that Jacob supplied. And then in chapter 27, trickery and deceitfulness took place with Rebekah and Jacob devising a plan on deceiving Isaac and really circumventing the blessing that Isaac planned on giving Esau. A lot of deceit, a lot of trickery going on. So due to the hatred that Esau had for his brother Jacob and even the intent of killing Jacob, Rebekah became privy of such and told Jacob of Esau's intentions and instructs him to flee to her brother Laban's place in Haran. And again, that's in chapter 27, specifically verse 42 down through verse 45. But as the chapters roll on, chapter 29, Jacob ends up falling in love with a beautiful young woman named Rachel, who was the daughter of his mother's brother. Now, that means that Rachel would be Jacob's cousin, okay, if you're following the family tree and all of those things. So Jacob worked 7 years for his future father-in-law for the privilege of getting married. Now, after 7 years, however, Jacob woke up on the day after his wedding only to find that he had been tricked and that he had actually married Rachel's older sister, Leah. But he was so in love, he made another deal with his father-in-law and promised to work yet another 7 years if he could marry both. Jacob is now married not to just 2 women, but to 2 sisters. Okay, Rachel and Leah then get into a competition as to having a baby in which there are 2 female servants get involved, and then there's a race between those 4 women, all desperate to get pregnant. Who got pregnant first? Leah. And there was much drama that followed that situation. And then Joseph is eventually born to Rachel. Okay, so we see a lot of history here, a lot of things that were going on in this family already. So Joseph is eventually born to Rachel in Genesis chapter 30 and verses 22 down through verse 24. But with the other women, Joseph is now one of 13 siblings, making it 12 boys, and of course they had 1 sister. And Rachel dies actually giving birth to Benjamin, her second child and the youngest of the entire group. And Joseph then from that point, roughly at the age of 10 years of age, he grows up without a mother. And also I would just throw in here and mention to add to all of this that Dinah, daughter of Leah, was raped by Shechem, who was prince of the country in Genesis 34. So if that wasn't enough to make your mind already kind of implode. So with no action taken by Jacob the father, Dinah's brothers act out a vengeance for Dinah, and they end up killing Hamor and Shechem and took Dinah from Shechem's house. And then Jacob's other sons joined Simeon and Levi in plundering the city. So not only that, but one of the brothers, being Reuben, had relations with one of his father's concubines. And again, all of this makes our minds just spin out of control. It's a lot to take in. And so again, I'm just briefly mentioning this, again, to kind of get a little history here as to some of the issues that they had going on in their life. So to get where we are in our study, Joseph is a teenager at this particular time. His mother has since died. His father has shown a continued pattern, if you will, with a lack of control with his children. Joseph was living with his father, stepmothers, and the very brothers who proved their capability to commit murder. And now with all of this information, your head again may be spinning like mine. There's a lot that's going on in this family. But as we are aware, there was much to come to add to this family's slights. So, with all of this family background in mind, again, as I went through that real quickly, Genesis chapter 37 is where we are going to be. Genesis chapter 37. And through our study this evening, we will find a refreshing reminder that although Joseph was definitely in a family with some serious issues, definitely the potential to make one's rightful, straight, faithful walk to God and with God difficult, it wouldn't make it impossible. Okay? So let's read together. Let's see as we think here in Genesis chapter 37. Genesis 37. That one of the first things that is striking in Genesis chapter 37, that just right off, that just catches your attention. And again, I want to bring these verses up as we walk through this passage together, is what you see in verse 3. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children because he was the son of his old age. Also he made him a tunic of many colors. What strikes me that Jacob is one who tends to show favoritism. And of course, we'll see more of that as we go through our series in this study. But Jacob favors Joseph. And that is plainly evident from what verse 3 says about Israel or Jacob, the father of Joseph, who loved Joseph more than all his sons because he was a son of his old age. And this is more than reaching in the closet when we think about this coat that he gave his son. We're talking about a coat that one may not, that's just amazing. This is something that really stands out here because Jacob took the time to make Joseph a coat of many colors. This coat that Joseph received from his father is described by Hebrew translation as one that had long sleeves and distinctive in color or design, being richly decorated and would have been actually costly. Okay, so I thought of this as if my father had made me a coat, which he never has made me a coat, but as to how that would make my brother feel. Okay, of course it would be very special. Since first of all, again, my dad has never made anything out of fabric, but not surprising that he would give it to me since, I am the favorite and even named after him to add that in. But by Jacob making and in turn giving Joseph such a coat would be really a big deal. And it would make a very powerful statement. And just think about the brothers of Joseph and that they are donning their labor clothing. And then they observe Joseph with his special, sentimental, handmade, fancy coat of many colors. Now, it might be like me going and working with my dad on a roof or building a house and me wearing a suit, okay? I don't think I would fit in with everyone there, would I? Maybe more like a supervisor over the work being done. And again, that's the kind of imagery that I would see here, that I would be exempt from certain things such as, work. And that is the kind of coat that Jacob gave his son Joseph, and it was apparently done for a reason. And again, that reason is underlined there before you, that he loved Joseph more than all his children, all his sons. And so this coat basically would carry with it a constant reminder that their father Jacob loved Joseph more than them. It's always a constant reminder. So here Joseph is, and he's much younger than his other brothers, 17 years of age. He's 12th out of 13 children, and he has, not been sweating and laboring as the others have through the years, and yet look what he receives from Dad, a beautiful coat of many colors. Jacob loved Joseph more than the others. He treated him better and with preference. Now, if we reflect again on Joseph's family history, we see this. We see this actually as a pattern in that family. Abraham, who is Joseph's great-grandfather, he showed preference to Isaac over Ishmael. When you look to Jacob's grandfather, Isaac, well, he showed preference to Esau over Jacob. And now Jacob is showing preference to Joseph over the others. So again, we see a pattern here, don't we? And really, by knowing how this chapter ends, because again, we've read this chapter, I know, many, many times in our lives, I think it's very evident that a lesson really is here for parents, for us as parents. When one child receives preferential treatment over another, there's going to be some kind of harmful consequences to such. And I would just submit that there's a difference between treating a child differently versus preferential treatment of one child over another. You know, Aiden and Jackson specifically, you know, they're different as night and day. And as we know as parents, children are different from one another. And so it's not wrong to treat children differently. The issue arises, though, when we do what Jacob did with Joseph, and that is showing favoritism. Showing favoritism. Cannot do it. Verse 4. Notice there in verse 4 what it says. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. So with this favoritism that we noted there right off in verse 3 of Genesis 37, Joseph's brothers, of course, observed this. This was quite evident in it. And so because of that, they absolutely, positively despised Joseph. And we see trouble, of course, on the horizon, don't we? We see trouble on the horizon. And there's more to this mounting issue that we have here, and that is jealousy upon hatred. Jealousy upon hatred. And you notice there in verse 4 again that Joseph's brothers absolutely despised Joseph with a passion, as we might say, as a passion. Because of such, they were not able to even speak with Joseph in a peaceable manner. And you know, we might even think back on our own families and our own issues that may have come up in our own families among our siblings, and we may understand this to some degree. The situation with Joseph kept on festering more and more with his brothers, and even as we go into verse 11, I want you to look what happens there as we connect these dots here in verse 11. And his brothers envied him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Joseph's brothers were envious. They were jealous of what Joseph had going for himself. And the jealousy was consuming them. Now, did you notice anything else in verse 11? Did you notice anything else? What does the verse say about what Jacob was privy to? He was privy to the situation between Joseph and his other sons. And there's a reason that I introduced the lesson with kind of a brief rundown, history, so we can understand what surely even Jacob understood, that his sons, the very brothers of Joseph, that they were capable of horrific behavior as in the murderous rampage years before. And knowing that his sons can't stand Joseph, that they couldn't even speak peaceably with him. And what I thought was astonishing is that although Jacob kept the matter in mind, knowing these things, he further goes on to send Joseph to check on his brothers. Now understand that that there's some things that come to pass here, especially with the dreams that Joseph had, and something that he would even tell his fathers and his own brothers about. We'll talk about that. And so again, Jacob is going to keep this in mind about this envy and that Joseph's brothers had, and the jealousy that was going on, that was again, not healthy. Okay, it wasn't healthy. And so look at that in verse 14. Although Jacob knows that the situation brewing between his other sons and that of Joseph, Jacob goes on to send Joseph to check on his brothers, as noted in verse 14. Please go and see if it is well with your brothers and well with the flocks, and bring back word to me. So he sent him out of the valley of Hebron, and he went to Shechem. Now, Joseph, of course, does as his father bids, and Joseph searches them out and finds them in Dothan. Now, I want you to notice in verse 18 that when the brothers saw Joseph afar off, even before Joseph came near them, that the brothers are found conspiring against Joseph to kill him. Now, while they are conspiring to kill Joseph, Reuben goes on and he stands there and provides basically another option, saying to them in verse 22, look at verse 22, he says to them, shed no blood, but cast him into this pit which is in the wilderness, and do not lay a hand on him, that he might deliver him out of their hands and bring him back to his father. Now, when you have family like that, who needs enemies, right? Okay? When you have family like that. And the reading of our text here, you notice that upon Joseph coming to his brothers, the first order of business was to take his coat of many colors before casting him into the pit. And look at verse 23 and 24. So it came to pass, look at this. So it came to pass when Joseph had come to his brothers that they stripped Joseph of his tunic, the tunic of many colors that was on him, but then they took him and cast him into a pit, and the pit was empty, there was no water in it. Now we find in the preceding verses that Judah conjures up another option, since they didn't kill him, and by leaving him in the pit there would be no profit. I mean, again, they got all this kind of going on here in verse 25 and 26, that they sit down to have a meal. They lifted up their eyes, they looked, and there was a company of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels, bearing spices, balm, and myrrh, and on their way to carry them down to Egypt. So Judah said to his brothers, what profit is there if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? And so what they do, as we know from this account, as we've read many times, is they sell Joseph to the Ishmaelites that are passing through. Now, Reuben was not privy to this plan, and upon finding out, he was grieved about what happened, especially being the oldest brother, of course. Well, who would be blamed, right? But when it comes to the cover-up, look at verse 32 and 33 of the text. Then they sent the tunic of many colors, and they brought it to their father and said, we have found this. Do you know whether it is your son's tunic or not? And he recognized it and said, it is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Without doubt, Joseph is torn to pieces. The plan is carried out to bring Joseph's coat, having been dipped in blood. So Jacob would believe that Joseph had been devoured by a wild beast. Now, I thought it's interesting how Joseph's brothers approached their father. I circled that, of what is something that is interesting with the very wording and how they say this. Even in investigations and in statement analysis that I've worked in, and how one who is guilty of some crime, especially in relation to family, will use words that will separate them from, dissociate them. And I see that in how Joseph's brothers refer to Joseph with that of Jacob, referring to Joseph as, your son, rather than Joseph, our brother, right? It is also interesting to note that here that Joseph's brothers used the blood of a kid of the goats to deceive their father Jacob. Jacob used skins of the kids of a goat to deceive his father Isaac into giving him the birthright. Again, we see the kind of history here. We kind of see a pattern here. And in Joseph's brothers were so filled with indignation, with such hatred, with such jealousy, that they were willing to basically burn down their own house to get rid of a rat, as we might say. And that's what hatred and jealousy can do. It's very, very dangerous. But what I want us to notice here, and I know that going through this text here is maybe a little fast for us, but I want us to notice here about Joseph. About Joseph. I believe it's worth mentioning as we audit Joseph's life that in verse 2, that Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brothers. And the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and Joseph brought a bad report of them to his father. You know, there's something that I believe that's really, again, worth noting here. And at the age of 17, number 11 out of 12 brothers, he goes out to pasture the flock with his brothers. And Joseph brought back a bad report about them to their father. Now, Joseph, most likely, in his integrity, was reporting some negligent things that his brothers were doing. And, of course, it is difficult to pinpoint what the intentions of young Joseph was in his report to his father. But I think we understand that due to such, Joseph's brothers would have a very strong resentment towards him. So there's something else to note there. And we have all this whole situation about the dreams that's going on. We don't have much to go off of, but I believe we can safely assume that Joseph was a seemingly enthusiastic young man who had a series of dreams. And again, I want to mention that because we know that about Joseph in this chapter, about the dreams that Joseph had. And in turn, what did he do with those dreams? Well, if you look at verses 5 down through verse 7, as we're backing up in this passage just to note a few other things, as by way of background, that Joseph, he had a dream, and he told it to whom? He told it to his brothers, didn't he? And they hated him even more. Did you notice that? So he said to them, "Please hear this dream which I have dreamed. There were there we were binding sheaves in the field. Then, behold, my sheaf arose and also stood upright, and indeed your sheaf stood all around and bowed down to my sheaf." Now, I can see Joseph telling his brothers this dream, wearing that beautiful coat of many colors, a dream that portrayed Joseph with prominence and them bowing down to him, that would eventually have in the family, which was obviously insulting to his brothers since it violated the custom of the time. And how did Joseph's brothers react to that? Verse 8, his brothers said to him, "Shall you indeed reign over us, or shall you indeed have dominion over us?" So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. And he would go on, as we noted, to tell his father, as we saw in verse 9, and tell his brothers about another dream in verse 9, and the matter would grow worse with his brothers. What I wanted to do in this chapter, that really it's a sad note that we close on in this chapter with the ill effects of what hatred, jealousy, favoritism can lead to. That although Joseph definitely had a very dysfunctional family that caused him basically a pit stop before being sold into slavery, but God is going to make something very good out of this pit stop, out of this bad situation at the hands of Joseph's own brothers. Now, I want you to simply ask from this text, have you ever had some unpleasant pit stops yourself in life? I wondered what Joseph would tell us just in this instance of Genesis chapter 37. I mean, knowing the account of Joseph, I thought that maybe the lesson Joseph would share with us is that when we are in our pit stops of life, to look up There he was, down in that pit. He had been stripped of his wonderful coat of many colors, going to be sold to the Ishmaelites, going to be taken off, sold into slavery, as we find. And when Joseph found himself at the bottom of that pit, though, he had nowhere to look but up, didn't he? Joseph couldn't get out of the pit on his own might or own strength. He was incapable of freeing himself from slavery. He didn't let those moments define him or the rest of his life. And again, Joseph is one of those characters that is so intriguing, that is so interesting, that Joseph continuously looks up and keeps believing. And I think he would tell us the same today. Don't stop believing. Don't stop believing. Don't allow the situations and circumstances that you face in your life define you or the rest of your life. You know, Joseph could have used this experience right then and there to turn away from God. He could have done that. He could have become bitter. He could have blamed God for his horrible family situation growing up. But thankfully, though, Joseph kept his faith in God. And it's quite apparent that Joseph's father, that he certainly was not perfect. His siblings were hateful. They were envious. I mean, there's several things there. But Joseph was not perfect himself. But he knew who was, and that is God. At the end of this chapter of Genesis 37, there's just really nothing good to really speak of. The situation was terrible. And at the age of 17, Joseph, being thrown into a pit, then sold into slavery by his own brothers. But God had a plan. And as we study this wonderful individual, this wonderful man, truly, again, a spiritual giant of his time, Joseph, I want us to think about this plan that God had to make this family into a great nation. And this, again, goes back to promises of God. That God not just had a plan for Joseph, but he also has a plan for us. And I hope that we can see that plan before us in the Scriptures, showing us how to get out of the pit of sin and slavery thereof and get to the God of our salvation. Maybe some of us are where Joseph was at this particular point in Genesis chapter 37. God sees what's going on and he understands and wants what's best for us. I thought of a story of a man who asked a small boy who just come home from Sunday school and said, "Son, can you tell me who made you?" And digging a toe in the ground, the little boy squinted an eye and he courteously replied, "To tell you the truth, mister, I ain't done yet." Those are some true words. They're some true words. As long as we are living and as we yield to God, God will continue to mold us and make us even in and through the unpleasant pit stops of life. Joseph would become a part of the solution as we will study further in upcoming lessons. Joseph's not done yet. He's not done yet. Like the little boy said, I ain't done yet. Continue to be molded and made today as God would have you. Thought about 2 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 18 that says, "But we all with open face, with unveiled face, beholding as in a mirror the glory of the Lord, are being transformed in the same image from glory to glory, just as by the Spirit of the Lord." That is what we truly see even in Joseph's life. A transformation that was taking place in his life. Didn't completely understand it, didn't know exactly what the dreams meant at that particular time, but there's a plan. He just had to continue, rely upon God, have faith in God, be patient, continue to do good, even in spite of difficult trials and circumstances that he would face. Joseph, great life lessons that we're going to learn from him. Again, in this chapter of 37, I think we see some valuable lessons that we can take from it, and I hope that you grab those and that you make those applications as I have as again I enjoy studying the life of Joseph yet again. Thank you for studying him with me, and I hope that you will continue to study with me as we go through this character Joseph upcoming. And as we think about what Joseph is teaching us, again, take away in your life about all of the things that you're facing, all of those things, those difficult trials and circumstances. If you found yourself in the pit of sin, and again, look up. Just look up. God is waiting to help you. God is wanting to help you. It's just we have to reach for Him. We have to lean on Him. He will see us through those trials, even those circumstances that we face, even as Christians. So again, thank you for joining me in this Bible study today, and stay tuned because we will be looking at the next part in Joseph's life as we study in Genesis. I hope you have a great day. God bless.